Today I'm talking with Michael Kraus, Director of Insider Threat Strategies at Raytheon. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Richard.
So insider threats are one of my favorite topics. Tell me, companies have limited dollars to spend. They're inundated with, real attacks from the outside. How do they make the decision to devote resources to countering insider threats?
I think the research really has to come down to a mindset. They have to adopt a new mindset. In the past, it's all been about external threats, protecting from the outside. I think organizations are now just beginning to realize a breach from an insider, even though the probability is lower, the consequences are much higher. So what they have to do is take some of the additional funding that could be available from the external and potentially reallocate that to an insider threat. And also they need to put a program in place. They need to have the proper processes, best practices, lessons learned, and you combine that with technology, you can have yourself an established insider threat program.
So how can you even identify an insider threat?
Well, if you look at the way Carnegie Mellon does it, if you look at Gartner, if you look at other kind of what we call thought leaders in a community, they look at 3 different models for an insider. They look at IT sabotage, they look at fraud, they also look at intellectual property theft. So if you look at those 3 models to start, you can kind of get to identify what the behaviors of an individual is for those models. And that's where I would start. I would start with that. I would identify the behavior, and then I would provide a kind of a plan around that behavior. What technologies you would use, what support you're going to need from internal, other stakeholders, to ensure that your plan is thorough and it's actually coordinated across many of your team.
Is there any special things you can look at to prevent insider attacks against systems that are supposedly secure? You know, your crown jewels on the inside, only employees have access.
Right. Well, one of the things that we like to say is privileged users, by definition, have privileges. So you really have to kind of look at the role of your privileged user, and each privileged user has certain activities they do, certain role, certain behavior that they exhibit. So one of the things we like to tell customers is that you kind of got to get a baseline of your team, a baseline of your employees. And from that baseline, you can see if there's deviations from that baseline based upon everyday activity. So it's something that's dynamic, something that's flexible, and something that you have to continually update. So as a person's role changes, you would actually change, say, the behavior. And you would have to account for that in your processes and best practices.
What are the tools that Raytheon has that help you counter insider threats?
So a couple tools we have. We use some of our existing IA tools, which Raytheon kind of started that way. We had some existing information assurance tool, your traditional SIMs, your traditional, say, external threats. We have a product called R-Shield that looks at external threats. What we did is we took those tools and complemented and supplemented them with our insider threat tool called SureView, which host-based solution allows you to provide the context of the information from the host. Because we believe all the action, all the behavior is at the host. You can only get so much information from the network layer. You really need to be at the host because that's where the user is interacting with his computer, with his asset, and that's where they're accessing company information from.
Is there a psychological component where somebody's behavior changes when they're, for instance, getting ready to leave that alerts you to monitor them more closely?
Yes, and that's one of the things that we're working on today. So we're actually teaming with third-party companies out there that do more behavioral analysis. We're actually building the framework, and what we're allowing our third-party best-of-breed people to plug into our framework and do that behavioral analysis part for us. Raytheon doesn't have a group of behavioral scientists sitting in the dark room looking at behaviors. What we like to do is say, let's look at the community, let's look at who's doing what in the community from commercial and government, and let's give them the framework and the access to data that'll allow them to do this behavioral analysis.
So if you're giving an employee access, so you're enrolling them in the system, what steps should you take to guard against future abuse?
Well, one of the things that we like to do is it comes down to really the training as well. You have to educate your workforce. You have to educate your employees. Because, when an employee always starts with a company, in my opinion, they're always trustworthy. You always trust them. I do not believe anybody comes within a company with the intent of doing badness right away, doing malicious behavior. But over time, there could be a factor that changes his opinion about your company, whether it's a bad performance review, whether it's an external factor out there like a financial concern, or it's something that changes the behavior of the individual, and you need to actually be able to monitor when that behavior changes to see if his access to computer information changes. Because you get an outside force that changes the behavior of your employee internally, and you have to be able to look at those behavior changes and maybe put them in a different group, a different auditing group, that you can protect your sensitive information.
Yeah, because even paid spies, the ultimate insider threat, I think, can be just regular trusted employees until they succumb to a blackmail or a honeypot or
something.
One of those things.
Something, an external factor
right.
changes their behavior. One of the things we like to say is trust and verify.
Right.
You should always trust your employees, but you should always verify them. One of the things that kind of came out of a couple of our conversation with other customers is that in the good old days when you had factory workers and you had your foreman up in the factory, I don't know if you remember that.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
He was sitting behind a glass wall, looking down at his employees. Was he spying on his employees? No, he was ensuring that they're doing their job. He was ensuring that they're being safe and they're complying with any kind of company regulations and they're doing their job efficiently. So it's kind of that day. We have a digital days, so we can actually use our digital technology to kind of be like that foreman, that guy who's overseeing the factory workers.
Do you do a good job of, I guess, informing them of the monitoring you're doing in order to hopefully curtail any thought of abuse?
So traditionally we have a banner that when it comes up, and I think all customers have this, that when you're logging into or accessing company information, you get a banner that comes up and said, per company regulations and compliance, there is an auditing that's going to be performed on the workstation. So during the in-dock process, they're aware of it. They are understanding of the process, and I think that does a good job deterring, but it is not 100% preventable. We found that out, that just like external threats, insider threats are not 100% preventable. I mean, you can do steps to mitigate the risk, but you can't always be 100%.
What do you do about the cases? Actually, one of the very first questions I ever got asked when I was at Gartner, somebody came to me and he said, we're really worried about this insider, doing something on our network. How do we discover what he's doing? And I said, well, there's all these tools, and I probably suggested Oakley as one of them at the time. And they said, yeah, but we think it's the IT security guy who would see any tools that were displayed. We
consider some of our customers more of both security, inspector general, operations guys. The IT people are involved probably with implementation of products like ours. But we just, for example, rolled out a network component, a network collector component of our host base, which allows you to, from a host, you can actually start looking at ports of the network. You can look at network traffic coming across, and it now takes that bridge from just looking inward on a computer behavior, somebody typing or somebody accessing a web page. Now you can start looking at network. You can look at ports being open, information being accessed. So that actually increases our portfolio, increases the exposure of what you can do from the endpoint.
How much do you get involved in the forensics, case building post-event, but the legal repercussions afterwards?
So that's more the reactive, and actually that's a kind of a very large part of our mission. A lot of our customers, for example, media leaks, whether you're government or commercial, media leaks is big. I mean, in commercial, it could have a devastation against stock prices, shareholders, confidence in your company.
Yep.
But one of the things we do is we have actually a limited discovery module where we can actually, if you're already deployed on your host for the product like SureView, you can actually quickly from the back end write a policy that says, hey, I want to go see if this file exists on my workforce. So it can go out actively, proactively go out and search after time and to identify if files exist and where they exist. So it gives you a sense of, if you have employees of 1,000 people and only 10 people should have access to this document, but 100 people have access to this document, you have a problem from an IT security point of view. That now you can do triage. These 90 people shouldn't have the document. You can maybe go talk to them. Why did you get the document? Where did you get the document from? How did you access and what did you do with it? So we have actually a way to not only be proactive in writing policies, but we can also be reactive in actually going out and pulsing the agents on the field.
What are some of the security technologies and practices that companies already have, but they're taking for granted and they could leverage better?
I think a lot of the SIMs out there, the SIMs what I prefer as the ArcSights of the world, the Spunks of the world, they have those tools in place. They have a lot of the FireEyes, the R-Shields in place looking at external parameters. I think all those are complementary, but it really only provides, you know, external threats coming in.
Yep.
DLP's big. You coming from Gartner, Gartner has always the magic quadrant for DLP. We always kind of joked with you should have an insider threat quadrant, but hopefully we'll see that coming from Gartner one of these days, where we'll actually be in the top right. That's my sales pitch. But DLP is another tool that complements what we have. But DLP, a couple of things that DLP has limitations is, DLP is more of your blocking and tackling. They're always about the act. So DLP, I had a customer showed us a DLP log once, and they come in and they go, look at this, and they get crazy, and they said, we have 8,000 DLP events that we have to do something about. And I looked at them like, so tell me, what's the context behind those events? They said, well, we don't know, but we need you to go do something about that. We're like, let's slow down. So that should give you a sense of what DLP always gets you the act, but it doesn't get you the context. It doesn't get you the intent. DLP is a good solution for blocking and tackling, protecting the perimeter, but it really provides more questions. You really don't get answers from DLP.
Yeah, it sounds like IDS all over again, right? All these alerts. And
yes.
Okay, we'll tackle the one that's marked red. And at the end of 2 shifts, okay, we got that one figured out. Now we have 16,000 more.
Yes.
Yeah.
My other question would be, why is it red?
Right. Yep.
You know, and how many man hours is going to take to determine how's it red? You know, so that's always a challenge for us to work with customers.
What are questions that CISOs should be asking of their internal people to see if they, you know, even are prepared to counter the insider threat?
I think they need to be asking all their teams, whether it's HR, whether it's inspector generals, whether it's operations people. They need to ask them a simple question, even about privileged users. You know, who's monitoring our privileged users? Who's actually controlling access by our privileged users? Do we have 2-person authentication in place? Do we need 2-person authentication in place? Because one of the things, if you notice by all the government actions that came out of 2-person authentication became a very big thing. We're going to put 2-person authentication in place. But the problem is, I believe that the business workflow, you have to be careful about the business workflow to ensure people can still do their job, because privileged users are one of the most valuable people in your organization. They have to do their job on a day-in, day-out basis. So your controls, your management controls, your processes need to allow people to do their jobs, but give them the right amount of auditing. So if I'm a CISO, I'm asking, do we have the right amount of auditing and monitoring? Do we have tools in existence today that we need to actually use and implement properly? Are we looking at our employees and what are roles of our employees, making sure the access of a privileged user, do they need to know all this information and control their access? So you can go step by step with a CISO and start laying out what a plan is and a program plan is.
Let's answer a question for me on Raytheon. So Raytheon's, you know, well known as a successful aerospace defense company, but what about reaching out with at least your security solutions to the broader market?
So we're doing a better job of that. We're actually working with our DIB partners, defense industrial-based partners, to actually assist in securing their infrastructure. If you notice, a lot of the regulations coming out, a lot of the compliance stuff comes out, is that not so much centered around government, it's really centered around contractors accessing information or having access to even government information. So we're really working with those customers to say, how are you securing your customers' data? How are you ensuring your customers' data is protected? You have company proprietary information to protect, but you also have your customers' data to protect. So we're reaching out to them, showing them what we're doing, showing them our best practices, introducing them to our tools and technologies, and helping them guide them. We also make introductions to thought leaders like Carnegie Mellon and Gartner to say, look, you don't have to always believe Raytheon. You know, I know we're competimates, you know, whether it's Lockheed, Northrop Grumman, General, we're all competimates. You know, we all have, at the end of the day, making revenue, making sales. We said, look, you know, if you need to know from thought leaders, reach out to the Carnegie Mellons of the world, the Gartners. They have information that's available to you for free of charge. And they would be more than welcome to help you. And what you're going to find is that the same thing they're saying, the same thing they're kind of providing a lesson learned is the same thing we've been telling people for the last 10 years.
What about pushing down from the direct contractors all the way down to the supply chain? Because by then you've covered a lot of industry.
Yeah, it's a broad, I mean, if you look at the market, it's huge. You know, a lot of people are getting insider threat speak now into their marketing slicks. We actually were doing insider threat before it became cool, before insider threat became a buzzword, before insider threat actually had money associated with it. And that's been a challenge. If you look at what the return on investment for a lot of the commercial customers, it was very difficult to actually measure, quantify the impact of a breach from an insider. And in fact, today, it's still very difficult. If you ask a company today to say, can you quantify the breach of an insider threat? They would probably struggle. They would probably struggle. So if they're struggling doing that, how can they go to the leadership and say, I want to buy something? And your leadership's going to go, what's your return on investment? And they go, I don't know. Maybe not on the front page of a newspaper that we had a breach. That maybe is a return on investment. So I think that's been a challenge. Going down to these vendors, how do you tell them? Because the bottom line is coming off the bottom line. The price is coming off the bottom line. How do you tell them and instruct them to say, you need to be proactive versus reactive? Because they might come back and say, well, what's my return on investment?
Put on your rosy-tinted glasses, look into the future, and tell me, if we're talking again 12 months from now, what we'll be seeing both from the threats from insiders and the responses that CISOs are making.
I think you're going to see more awareness. I think what we're doing right now, by talking to you, by talking to other publications, we're raising the awareness of an insider threat. So what you're seeing is that companies like Raytheon are out there raising the awareness, then that companies out there going, wow, if Raytheon is really concerned about the insider threat, what do we need to do? Whether your company's small, whether it's large, whether you're government, whether you're commercial, it doesn't matter. The insider threat is out there. He's out there with every company. And what we need to do is continue to raise awareness. We continue to provide tools that can be flexible, that can work across all spectrums, whether it's a commercial retail, government. You have to have tools that are flexible, and you have to educate them to make sure they understand what actually the true insider threat breach is all about.
Great. Thank you very much, Mike, for educating us on insider threats.
Thanks, sir. Appreciate it.